It was, as Lord Peter remarked later, the sort of funeral one only endures out of politeness, or if one is particularly fond of badly played Mendelssohn. Certainly few in attendance had known the late Mr. Jasper Thrale well enough to grieve with any sincerity, and fewer still would have chosen to brave the slush-rimmed lanes of Lower Quinton, if not for the promise of sandwiches and the stubborn English obligation to be seen doing the proper thing. The deceased had expired in the conservatory of Gloucester Hall, ostensibly of heart failure, some 3 days prior. His demise had been, in the words of the village physician, convenient in timing, but not entirely unanticipated. A statement that, though cloaked in medical detachment, bore the tang of something altogether more literary. Mr. Thrale had, after all, been a man of health robust enough to brandish croquet mallets at trespassing youths only the week before, and was known in the village for a constitution as redoubtable as his opinions on post-war land taxes. Lord Peter Wimsey had not known Jasper Thrale. His invitation to the funeral had arrived in the form of a telephone call from the redoubtable Lady Andromeda Fritchley, née Thrale, who declared herself positively deranged with confusion and demanded Peter's immediate assistance in sorting out a perfectly beastly muddle of grief and green crape. Wimsey arrived late, as was his custom when timeliness would only expose him to hymns. He stepped quietly into the back pew of the unheated chapel of St. Oswald's, adjusting his gloves with the abstract care of one brushing invisible lint from a metaphor. The vicar droned gently at the lectern. The congregation exhaled fog. Lady Fritchley sat bolt upright and trembling beneath a ludicrous black-veiled hat, which gave her the look of a startled raven on a tea-cake. Next to her sat the newly made widow, Mrs. Honoria Thrale, a picture of controlled distress, chin lifted, shoulders firm, gloved hands folded over a handbag so green it might have been plucked fresh from a topiary. Peter's monocle swung slowly in its arc as he examined the bag. Then his eyes drifted up. The widow's dress, cut respectfully high at the collar and falling to the appropriate length at the hem, was also green. Not a sombre olive or a muted forest, but a brisk, almost cheerful shade of spring grass. It was an impeccable garment, stitched by someone who charged more than honesty could justify, and it was entirely, extravagantly inappropriate. After the service, Wimsey was cornered in the lich-gate by Lady Fritchley, who had abandoned mourning propriety in favor of a practical wool coat and the scent of orange lozenges. "I tell you, Peter," she said in a whisper, not sufficiently quiet to avoid the attention of a lingering curate. "Something's off. She's been dreadfully composed. Never liked Jasper, of course. Who did? But to wear green, of all things. And so soon." "Green," said Wimsey, "is the colour of new life, growth and envy." One must ask which she was most eager to communicate. Lady Fritchley sniffed. She's not our kind, of course, and she's always been odd. But even for her, well, you'll stay, won't you? Lord Peter turned toward the hall where guests were already drifting for cold tongue and questions asked too casually. Snow trembled on the eaves. Somewhere, a clock struck the half-hour, ever so slightly out of sync with its echo. He smiled thinly. "I should hate," he said, "to miss the sandwiches." The entrance hall of Gloucester Hall, with its mournful oil portraits and ancestral gloom, received Lord Peter Wimsey like an old schoolmaster grudgingly acknowledging a favourite pupil. He divested himself of hat and gloves with an absent flourish, murmuring pleasantries to a footman so spectral he might have been imagined, then turned his attention to the drawing-room where the bereaved assembled for sandwiches and scrutiny. Mrs. Honoria Thrale stood with an elegance honed by bridge clubs and boarding schools. She greeted each mourner with a perfectly calibrated blend of sorrow and detachment, her green dress standing out like a spring leaf in a forest of sable and crepe. Wimsey observed her from a discreet angle behind a carved walnut urn and watched as she accepted condolences without trembling, flinching, or, most damning of all, hesitation. She made no effort to conceal her composure. If anything, she seemed faintly annoyed by the day's requirements. "Very game of her," murmured Whimsy, more to himself than anyone in particular. Lady Andromeda Fritchley drifted to his elbow, having abandoned the buffet entirely. "You see it, don't you?" she whispered. "The green. The smile. It's all wrong, Peter. Jasper might have been a pig, but one expects the decencies." "She wears her grief," he replied, "like a tailor's dummy wears a suit, neatly fitted but uninhabited." He turned to intercept a tray bearing tea and something that aspired to be watercress. "Tell me, my dear Andromeda, what precisely happened? You rang me in the middle of Act 2 and said there was a muddle. Was it only the frock, or have we something more robust?" Lady Fritchley hesitated, casting a glance over one shoulder. "They say it was his heart. Collapsed in the conservatory Tuesday morning. No fuss, no final words. Cook found him. He'd gone to look at his wretched chrysanthemums." Whimsy blinked. "In June?" "Exactly. That's the first oddity. The second being that no one weeps over a man who spent June with winter flowers," he said, sipping his tea. "Do go on." "They say he died sometime before 10. Honoria says she was in the breakfast room reading the Times, and no one disputes it, but, well, there's a queer feeling about it. He wasn't ill. He had a bit of wind, but no worse. Saw the doctor a fortnight ago, only mild warnings. And there's been no post-mortem. She forbade it. Oh yes, said it was sacrilege. Religious qualms, apparently. Jasper would have laughed. And you?" "I think she's hiding something," Lady Fritchley said simply. "She's up to something, and Jasper dying was part of it, whether she intended it or not. Do speak to the servants, Peter. You always know when someone's lying about the toast." That particular honor fell to Miss Marigold Braxley, the housemaid, whom Whimsy discovered in the butler's pantry amid folded napkins and a faint smell of vinegar. She was a round-eyed, plain-cheeked girl of about 25, whose notions of grief were clearly complicated by the arrival of an aristocrat in spats. "Oh yes, my lord," she said, cheeks colouring furiously. "I were up at 6 as usual. Mrs. Thrale always likes her paper ironed and her coffee at 7:30, though lately she's been having it later, since the weather turned." "Quite. And Mr. Thrale?" She hesitated. "He came down around 8, asked for the keys to the conservatory. He said the new white chrysanthemum had opened. I gave him the keys and he went off that way." "Seemed well?" "Well enough," she said, uncertain. "Maybe a bit pale. But he were always pale. The sort of man as never gets ruddy, if you take me." Whimsy nodded. "And then?" "Well, Cook went to fetch the lunch menus around 10 and found him there, slumped against the potting table, like he were reaching for the door. Dr. Pumphrey came within the hour and said it were his heart." "And Mrs. Thrale was where?" "In the breakfast room. She always stays in there till 10:30 or 11. Reads her paper, listens to the wireless, doesn't want to be disturbed. Won't even have the dog in." "Ah," said Whimsy. "So the dog was not in the room?" "No, sir. He'd been out in the backyard. I fetched him back when Cook shouted." "Good," said Whimsy. "Was anything unusual that morning? Anything broken, missing, or, how shall I put it, unseasonable?" Miss Braxley looked puzzled. "You mean like the green dress?" Whimsy allowed himself a flicker of a smile. "You noticed?" "Everyone noticed. It were made new, I think. She had it last week from town. Her dressmaker sent a box. I took it up to her room myself. She'd said she wanted something smart for the garden party, but, well, that's cancelled now, I suppose." "Yes, death does rather put one off dainty cucumber sandwiches," said Whimsy. "Did she say anything odd?" "Not really, my lord, only she seemed in a funny mood the night before." "Nervous?" "She didn't eat much supper." "And Mr. Thrale?" She hesitated again. "Cross. He were cross with her. Told her not to wear scent in the evenings. Said it gave him headaches." "Scent," said Whimsy, lifting a brow. "Do you recall the perfume?" No, sir, but I remember it had a sort of bitter smell, not flowery. I see. Thank you, Miss Braxley. That will do for now. One last thing. Do you know whether the conservatory door was locked when Mr. Thrale went in? She shook her head. Don't think so. But he always locked it from the inside after going in. He said it kept the draughts out. No one else much used it but him. Whimsy left her polishing cutlery and made a note to visit the conservatory himself. But first, he paid a call on Dr. Pomfrey, whose surgery smelt of liniment and dying ferns. Pomfrey, a stout man with a pince-nez and the confident air of someone rarely contradicted, greeted Whimsy with the vague politeness of a man who fears he might be late for a boil lancing. Yes, I signed the certificate, he said. Heart failure, no question. His father died the same way. I've seen it before. Indeed, said Whimsy, perching delicately on the edge of a cracked leather chair. And no signs of chemical interference, poison. Pomfrey bristled. There was no reason to suspect anything so melodramatic. No marks, no bruises. Just a man of 67 who'd had too much meat and too little moderation. Moderation, murmured Whimsy. A most un-British virtue. Tell me, Doctor, did you see the body in situ? Yes. He'd collapsed by the door, one hand on the table, the other on the key. Looked as though he was trying to get out. Face down. Pale. No scent? No odd color to the lips? The doctor frowned. Now that you mention it. There was a faint smell of almonds, but that's not uncommon, and the room was full of compost and flower bulbs. Easily confused. Whimsy stood. Thank you, Doctor. You've been most illuminating. Outside, the slush had begun to refreeze, and the gardens of Gloucester Hall glittered with a kind of brittle menace. Whimsy turned toward the conservatory. The door was shut, the latch secure. Inside, chrysanthemums bloomed in white disarray, lush, deliberate, unseasonal. It was too warm by half, and a small brass heater ticked quietly in the corner. Whimsy sniffed. Beneath the earthy scent of mulch and peat, a whisper of something acrid still lingered, bitter and faint, like burnt almonds and iron. He stooped to inspect the floor near the table, where a dark smudge marred the tiles. Not blood. Not quite. Something had spilled, dried and been cleaned, not well. His eye caught a small object nestled beneath the edge of the heater. A silver thimble, scorched slightly on one side. Whimsy straightened, slid his hands into his coat pockets, and looked up at the glass-paneled roof. Chrysanthemums in June, he murmured, a peculiar passion. Behind him, the hall loomed politely, waiting. Lord Peter remained in the conservatory, longer than politeness required, bending now and then as though admiring a blossom, but in fact noting the irregularities of the space, the faint scorch on the heater's casing, the curious absence of gardening gloves, the smudged outline of something that had once lain on the potting table and had since been hastily removed. He picked his way along the tiled floor with a practiced eye, noting minute scuffs in the dust near the base of the shelves and the odd displacement of soil in one pot where a bulb had clearly been reburied in recent haste. The silver thimble he'd pocketed without comment. No one had mentioned needlework. No one had, in fact, mentioned anything at all that might suggest the presence of sewing, mending, or habits, even vaguely domestic. Honoria Thrale did not strike one as a woman inclined to darn a sock unless it could be done at Harrod's, and the housemaid had made no mention of such occupations. He retraced his steps through the garden hall and passed again into the drawing-room, where the remnants of the morning assembly had thinned to a polite trickle. He caught sight of the widow seated beside the fireplace, one gloved hand resting lightly on a half-eaten sandwich, her posture as precise as the hinges on a new piano. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, every movement designed to feel accidental. "Mrs. Thrale," he said, bowing with exaggerated courtesy. "Forgive the intrusion, Lord Peter Whimsy." I believe we share a mutual acquaintance in your cousin Andromeda, who tells me I am to be at your disposal for any number of unrequested services." The widow looked up. Her eyes were large and clear, with the stillness of something watched rather than watching. "Ah, yes," she said in a voice cultivated for bridges and funerals. "She mentioned you might appear. How efficient of you to do so before the tea had even cooled." "I pride myself on arriving before the soup thickens," said Whimsy. "May I sit?" She gestured to the chair beside her. "If you must, though I warn you, I'm told I'm poor company at the best of times, and this—" she glanced briefly toward the black ribbon affixed to a nearby portrait— "is not the best of times." "You seem to be bearing up with admirable discipline," he said lightly. Her eyes flicked to him, then away. Discipline was Jasper's favorite word. Really, I should have pegged him for a rectitude man myself. Still, one must be consistent in one's posthumous character building. "May I ask, did he often retreat to the conservatory before breakfast?" She shrugged one narrow shoulder. "It was his domain. He called it his temple. Heaven help the maid who forgot to fill the watering cans. He was devoted to chrysanthemums." "Devoted," she echoed. "He kept them like mistresses, nurtured them in secret with expensive equipment and unseemly passion. I was not permitted to touch the thermostat." "Ah," said Whimsy, "an intimate triangle. Man, wife, and potted Flora." She gave a brief, brittle laugh. "If only all men's affairs were rooted in loam, it might spare the rest of us the trouble of scandal." Whimsy considered her profile, elegant and hard-edged, like the leading lady in a play that never made it out of dress rehearsal. He sipped from the cup of tea a maid had thoughtfully supplied and leaned back, folding one leg over the other. "I wonder," he said idly, "whether you might help me with a minor point of confusion." Her eyebrows lifted. "A confusion?" "Indeed. In the conservatory, I noticed the white chrysanthemum your husband admired. Exquisite. But as it happens, that particular variety is extremely delicate. Japanese, I believe, and not prone to early blooming, even under glass." "I wouldn't know." "Quite so," he said, "but it seems to have bloomed rather miraculously this week, unseasonably as it were, and I noticed that the soil around its stem had been recently disturbed. Rather clumsily." She said nothing, but her fingers tapped once, lightly, against the porcelain saucer. "It gave me to wonder," he went on, "whether something might have been planted there, something other than the plant itself." She turned to him then, with a level gaze. "What precisely are you suggesting, Lord Peter?" "I?" He spread his hands innocently. "Nothing, dear lady. I make a hobby of speculative horticulture, though I do wonder at the peculiar smell in the room. Not altogether floral. A bitter sort of thing, faintly reminiscent of prussic acid. Most unpleasant in tea, or, say, perfume." Honoria's eyes narrowed. "You think he was poisoned?" "I think," said Whimsy delicately, "that it is my instinct, when a man dies too early and too quietly, to verify that his death was also too convenient." She said nothing for a moment, only folded her gloved hands over her lap and looked again into the fire. Then, in a tone so light it might have floated from a much older, much crueler play, she said, "You must speak to the gardener, then. Perhaps he'll explain the miracle bloom." Whimsy inclined his head. A splendid idea. The gardener, as it turned out, was not immediately available. He had gone into town for supplies, and no one could say when he'd return. But Whimsy made a note to locate him shortly. For now, there was another conversation to be had. He found the butler, a man named Prestwick, in the silver closet, polishing a set of fish knives with the focused irritation of one raised to higher standards than these. "Prestwick," said Whimsy cheerfully, "you have the look of a man too intelligent for his household. Tell me, do you know where I might find a list of the late Mr. Thrale's medications, if any?" The butler frowned. "Medications, sir? I believe there was only the occasional powder for indigestion. Mr. Thrale disliked doctors." So do I, unless they're fictional. No powders recently. I prepared one for him myself on Monday evening, Prestwick said, from the usual tin in the cabinet. I noticed he left it untouched. I thought he might take it later, but it was still there in the morning. Wimsey's eyes sharpened. Was it still in the cabinet when the doctor arrived? Prestwick hesitated. I don't rightly recall. It may have been. I can check, sir. Do, and tell me, was anyone else in that cabinet after you? Only Mrs. Thrale. She said she was tidying up before the vicar came to pay his call. Wimsey smiled without humour. How conscientious. One more thing. Have any of the staff recently been dismissed? The butler straightened. Only the seamstress, sir. Temporary, of course. Came in last week to let out a gown. Left on Thursday. Would you be terribly shocked to learn she left her thimble behind? Prestwick blinked. I can't imagine how, sir. Mrs. Thrale's gowns are sent out now. The girl, Miss Marwick, had her own kit, I believe. Indeed, murmured Wimsey. And Miss Marwick? Was she working in the conservatory? Good heavens, no. Sewing's always done in the east parlour. But she had access to the house? Certainly. Wimsey thanked him and turned away. The story was starting to twist like ivy around a trellis, tightly, predictably, but not yet to the root. Later that evening, after supper had been served and the household had withdrawn into the uneasy silence of morning, Wimsey returned to the conservatory once more. The heater had been switched off. The room was dark now, the glass above clouded with frost. He moved carefully, listening to the hush of cold earth and the creak of settling beams. In his pocket, the thimble still lay, cool and smooth. He crouched by the flower bed, unbuttoned his sleeve, and reached carefully into the pot of white chrysanthemums. With slow fingers, he sifted the soil. His fingers brushed something slick, cellophane. He withdrew it. Inside was a tiny glass vial, its neck broken, its contents long gone. He rose slowly, staring at it in the faint light. The widow had not wept. The gardener was missing, and a woman had worn green in a house where a man had died too quietly for peace. Wimsey smiled, just a little. The timing would need testing, and the past, someone's past, was beginning to rustle faintly beneath the surface. Tomorrow he would go in search of Miss Marwick, but tonight he would wait, because something in the hall had not yet revealed itself, and if he listened closely, he might hear it trying. Lord Peter did not sleep that night, or rather, he lay in the guest chamber at Gloucester Hall beneath several tons of monogrammed eiderdown and stared at the ceiling with the speculative interest of a man listening for the first movement of mice in a wall he hadn't previously noticed. Outside, frost feathered the windows with intricate traceries that would have made a medieval illuminator weep. Inside, the clock on the mantel ticked with a calm regularity that made the irregularity of his thoughts all the more noticeable. Mrs. Thrale's confession, or near enough to be damning in the right, light, had not satisfied him. She had motive, certainly, and the temperament of a woman accustomed to repressing unpalatable truths with classical dignity. But there was something brittle in her self-possession, something performed. Her grief, like her admission, was too artful to be entirely trusted, and yet what she said rang with a note of injured truth, as if she were not the architect of Jasper's end, so much as the audience, applauding from the wings while another took the final bow. Just past dawn, Wimsey was up, dressed, and thumbing through the shelves in the library once again. Mr. Thrale had been fond of philosophy and second-hand metaphysics, but also kept surprisingly precise accounts of his garden expenditures. Wimsey, idly curious, leafed through one of the thinner ledgers. Among purchases of peonies and potash, there it was, a notation dated a month prior. New heater element installed. Conservatory, T.H. He closed the book slowly. After breakfast, he made his way to the back of the house, where the conservatory, now emptied of mourners and police tape, stood in still disarray. A few leaves remained scattered across the tiled floor, alongside the charred black mark where the small portable heater had stood. Its coil, he now observed, had a distinct singe at one end. He crouched, brushing his fingers along the tiles. There was a faint residue, a crystalline smear that could have been sugar or something rather less innocent. He scraped a trace into a matchbox and stood. Behind him, a throat cleared. He turned to see Jenkins, the houseman, looking vaguely uncomfortable in his stiff-collared morning coat. "Beg pardon, my lord. Didn't mean to intrude." "Not at all, Jenkins. In fact, your timing is admirable. A question, if you don't mind. Who had access to the conservatory heater in the days before Mr. Thrale's passing?" The man considered. "Well, I suppose Mrs. Thrale, of course. She liked to take her reading there in the mornings. Kept it on a timer. I believe she set it herself." "And the staff?" Jenkins hesitated. "Mr. Mould, the under-gardener, brought it in. Set it up with the electrics man, but after that, only Mrs. Thrale. I believe she told cook not to fuss with it." "Very good," said Whimsy. "Now, you've been with the family some years." 30, sir." "Then perhaps you can tell me, did Mr. Thrale ever take brandy before bed?" "Every night, sir." "And who prepared it?" "Cook poured it, I carried it. Silver tray, crystal decanter, ritual, like clockwork." "Was it brandy he took the night he died?" "No, sir. He asked for tea. Surprised me." "Did he drink it all?" "Half, I believe. Then rang for a second cup. Mrs. Thrale took it in herself." Whimsy's eyes brightened. "Thank you, Jenkins. That will do admirably." He left the conservatory and walked briskly back toward the drawing-room, pausing only to collect a letter from the sideboard. An envelope he had slipped into the post-tray the previous evening, now miraculously returned, unopened, by the sleepy postmaster who had failed to spot the Dorset address meant for hand delivery. The envelope had been addressed to Miss Daisy Flinch, Gloucester Village. The note within was his own, requesting a quiet word. By 10 o'clock, he was at the rear of the vicarage, where Daisy Flinch, aged 14, stood with her pinafore in her hands and eyes wide as saucers. She had the look of a girl who'd once been caught sneaking toffee from a chapel pantry and never quite recovered her sense of moral equilibrium. "Miss Flinch," said Whimsy, "I wonder if I might ask you something rather odd." She nodded solemnly. "Did you by any chance deliver a note to Mrs. Thrale on Tuesday afternoon?" She blinked. "Yes, sir. I mean, I wasn't to say." "I quite understand. But as it happens, discretion is an overrated virtue in matters of death." "Who gave you the note?" Her gaze dropped to the gravel. "Mr. Victor." "Mr. Victor. Mr. Victor Larch." She nodded. "He said it was urgent. Said she was to read it in private." Whimsy's smile was bland. "And did you see her read it?" "She opened it right there, then told me to go back by the side path." Whimsy thanked her with a shilling and a peppermint lozenge, then made his way at once to the cottage on the edge of the estate where Victor Larch had been staying. A writer of sorts, Victor was Mrs. Thrale's nephew by her first marriage, a thin man with sharp features and the faint smell of ink clinging to his fingers. He greeted Whimsy with evident surprise and only slightly concealed wariness. "Lord Peter? Rather early, isn't it?" "Not at all. You look like a man who keeps irregular hours." Victor flushed slightly. "Can I help you?" "You might." Whimsy stepped inside without invitation. "I'm curious about a note you sent to your aunt on Tuesday." "By Daisy Flinch." Victor stiffened. "What of it?" "Only that it appears to have caused a minor adjustment in routine. Your uncle requested tea instead of brandy that evening." Victor looked blank. "I don't follow." "You will. Let's not pretend the note didn't concern his health, or, more precisely, something you suspected your aunt might be administering to undermine it." Victor paled. "She told me she'd stopped," he muttered. "She promised, but I thought, just in case. I warned her I'd go to the police." "And did you?" "No. He was already dead by morning. Whimsy studied him. Then we may be nearer the truth than I thought. Victor said nothing. Tell me, Mr. Larch, did you ever smell anything odd in the conservatory? Victor's lips twitched. Yes, like almonds. But I assumed it was the orchids, or one of Aunt Honoria's new lotions. I'm afraid not. Almonds are rarely botanical in that context. That afternoon, the coroner's report arrived by courier. Whimsy read it in silence and then nodded once. Cyanide, it confirmed. Traces in the bloodstream consistent with inhalation, not ingestion. No sign of it in the teacup, but a residue on the glass of the heater's cover, consistent with slow-burning potassium cyanide when combined with heat. Back at the hall, he asked to see Mrs. Thrale again. She looked at the report and blinked. Then I didn't poison him. No, said Whimsy softly. You merely created the theatre in which he could be poisoned. Her mouth opened, but it was not indignation that followed, only a kind of stunned curiosity. Then who? Whimsy answered gently. The question isn't who, it's how. Someone knew you would alter his routine. Someone who overheard Victor's warning. Someone who'd have access to a heater and a conservatory and knew you'd sent the staff away that evening. Her hands clenched. The under-gardener? No, said Whimsy. Jenkins. And from the doorway behind them, Jenkins stepped forward, very quietly, and said, I was fond of Miss Lydia, sir. Mr. Thrale beat her. Twice, then paid to silence it. Mrs. Thrale gasped. She took laudanum last March, said Jenkins. No one ever told you, ma'am. He wouldn't allow it, but I buried her handkerchief myself. Whimsy said nothing. The man's voice, even in confession, held no emotion. I saw your note, ma'am, on the tray. You wrote it before taking in the second cup of tea. I thought he'd drink it and it would be over. But he didn't, so I helped it along. By placing a crystal on the heater, said Whimsy. A shaving, sir, mixed with his pipe ash, burned just enough. And you thought no one would notice? No one ever does. But someone had. Someone always does, Whimsy thought, as he turned to lead the man from the room. ChatGPT said. Whimsy made no remark as he walked beside Jenkins through the chilly morning mist that clung to the gardens like damp silk. The man's tread was light, almost reverent, as though escorting himself to some private altar rather than the local constable. Whimsy, for his part, felt no triumph. In fact, he had the uneasy sensation of having opened a drawer in an old bureau, only to find that the contents had arranged themselves into a shape too neat to trust. It was not that Jenkins's confession had been implausible. On the contrary, its very plainness was suspicious. The murder, if one accepted the method, had been almost absurdly delicate. Cyanide subtly introduced into the heater's element during a brief interval of privacy. But something in Jenkins's bearing, his grave self-effacement, his oddly rehearsed tone, suggested a man who had decided to shoulder a burden that might not be wholly his. Tell me, said Whimsy as they turned onto the narrow gravel path that led to the gardener's shed. How did you come to know the properties of cyanide, combustion? It is not the sort of thing one picks up pruning hydrangeas. Jenkins gave a slight cough. Read it in the library, sir. Mr. Thrale kept a number of scientific books. Ah, yes, Whimsy said dryly. Our dear departed was fond of his homegrown chemistry, was he not? Curious that a man with such interests should never think to lock the conservatory cabinet, or notice that his heater smelt of bitter almonds. They reached the cottage gate, where Sergeant Brewster was waiting with a weary expression and the look of a man trying not to sneeze into his own mustache. He received Jenkins with a respectful nod and a wordless gesture toward the station, then turned to Whimsy. You've done it again, my lord. Clean as a whistle, not so much as a footprint out of place. Whimsy gave a wintry smile. So it would appear. Only, you know, Sergeant, clean things have always made me nervous. They tend to suggest someone has been very busy scrubbing. He turned and walked back toward the hall, his thoughts now circling more tightly. Jenkins, it was true, had access, opportunity, and, if his story were to be believed, a deeply personal motive. And yet the timing was too precise. The residue on the heater suggested the cyanide had been activated during the precise period when Mrs. Thrale had sent the staff away and taken in the second cup of tea. The heater had been on all afternoon, yet the fatal dose had not released until after dusk. That required control, calculation. It was not an act of passion, but performance. At the top of the long stone steps leading into the house, Victor Larch was smoking one of his damp little cigarettes and staring into the middle distance with all the thoughtful despair of a man composing the final paragraph of a doomed novel. "You've arrested Jenkins," he said without turning. "Not I," said Whimsy lightly. "He arrested himself." Victor flicked ash into a nearby flower pot. "Do you believe him?" "I believe he believes himself," said Whimsy, "which is not always the same thing." Victor looked at him sharply. "You think he's lying?" "No, merely cooperating with someone else's truth." Victor's cigarette twitched. "You mean he's covering for someone?" Whimsy gave a delicate shrug. "My dear fellow, cover is a strong word. One might say he has voluntarily assumed a role, rather like an understudy stepping into a performance after the star breaks a leg." Victor turned to look at him properly now. "And who, pray, is the star?" "Perhaps," said Whimsy thoughtfully, "someone who knew exactly when the heater would be on, when the staff would be absent, and how to time a release precisely when the victim was most likely to linger in the room." Victor's face shifted slightly. "You're implying my aunt." Whimsy raised a brow. "Would it surprise you?" Victor looked away. "She wouldn't have done it herself." "No," said Whimsy, "but she might have written a note. A rather emphatic note, perhaps too emphatic for Jenkins to have discovered it by accident. One wonders, was it meant to be found?" Victor's mouth opened, then closed again. "Tell me," Whimsy continued, his voice gently conversational, "when you gave Daisy that note to deliver, did you see your aunt's face as she read it?" "I did." "And was she surprised?" Victor hesitated. "No, she looked resolute." "Curious," said Whimsy. "And the note itself, was it in your handwriting?" Victor flushed. "I typed it." "But signed it?" He didn't answer. Whimsy inclined his head slightly. "I rather thought so. Forgive me, but your aunt is a woman of a particular sort, trained to survive grief with elegance, but not to devise crimes of chemical intricacy. You, however—" "I didn't?" "No, you didn't. Not directly. But you may have told someone who could." Victor turned pale. "She loved Lydia," he whispered. "She hated him for what he did. But she wouldn't." "She may not have intended it," Whimsy said gently. "But intentions are unreliable things. She may have hoped to frighten him, or perhaps to encourage someone devoted, someone eager to help, to do what she could not." Victor was silent. Whimsy sighed and reached into his coat pocket, producing a slender object wrapped in a handkerchief. It was the heater's timing switch, recently removed by the electrician at Whimsy's suggestion. "I'm afraid the mystery lies here. The cyanide was not just placed, it was released by a timer, an old one, clumsy but accurate enough, and someone had to adjust it for the right moment, after Mrs. Thrale had left the room, after Jenkins had vanished into the back, and just before the victim's regular evening stroll." Victor stared at the device as though it might start ticking again. "That takes more than impulse," Whimsy murmured. "It takes study, familiarity. Someone who knew the heater's wiring, knew the house's rhythm, and wanted the death to appear like a sad accident. A frail man, overcome by fumes and old age." "Then why confess?" Victor muttered. "Why would Jenkins—" "Because he was asked, kindly or tearfully, or perhaps he offered before she could. A loyal man, Jenkins, but not inventive. He would never have thought of cyanide through an electric coil. He would, however, know how to keep a secret. Victor swallowed hard. Then you're saying she did it after all? I'm saying she may not know she did, Whimsy replied quietly, or not in the way you imagine. Sometimes grief and guilt find allies in places even we don't anticipate. There was a long silence between them. Later that day, after speaking quietly with the magistrate and arranging that Jenkins be held with due leniency until further inquiries could be concluded, Whimsy returned to the drawing-room, where Mrs. Thrale was seated once again in her upright chair, knitting something in an austere shade of slate grey. He watched her hands for a moment. Nimble, precise, utterly composed. A remarkable servant, Jenkins, he said conversationally. She nodded without looking up. Yes, too loyal, perhaps. Indeed, loyalty, like cyanide, is a substance best handled with gloves. She looked up at him sharply then, and something passed across her face. Grief, guilt, perhaps merely comprehension. But she said nothing. Whimsy inclined his head. I shall take the afternoon train. I believe the matter here is, for the time being, concluded. You've been most thorough, Lord Peter. He bowed slightly. Madame, I endeavour always to remove dust with as little damage to the surface as possible. One must preserve the lacquer, even when the wood beneath is cracked. And with that, he took his leave, pausing only once in the hallway to regard the old portrait of Lydia that hung near the stairs. She looked, he thought, faintly amused. Whimsy did not immediately follow Victor into the frost-bitten garden. Instead, he lingered in the study, a tall figure silhouetted against the pale morning light filtering through the diamond-paned windows, turning the last of the documents over with slender, impatient fingers. There was something about Victor's role in the affair that felt unfinished, as if the man had played a scene too carefully, his lines rehearsed not for concealment, but for the peculiar moral benefit of an unseen audience, perhaps himself. The facts, as they stood, were sufficient for the constabulary. A devoted servant, compelled by long-suppressed loyalty, had confessed to administering the fatal poison. The mechanism, cyanide released slowly through heat, was ingenious, but not impossible. The timing, precipitated by Victor's anonymous note to Mrs. Thrale, had created a convenient confluence of guilt and opportunity. A tidy tale, too tidy perhaps, for there remained that small matter of the second teacup. Jenkins had said Mrs. Thrale carried it in. Victor had said nothing of it, and Mrs. Thrale, when confronted, had seemed oddly unsurprised by the accusation, as if it were a role she had rehearsed long before it was cast. Whimsy stepped out into the brittle air, the frost underfoot crackling like burnt sugar, and made his way toward the hedge gate. Victor was standing by the stone balustrade that overlooked the lower gardens, a cigarette held in one trembling hand, the smoke rising in lazy, uncertain spirals. Mr. Larch, Whimsy said amiably, I have always believed that solitude is best reserved for the guilty and the newly betrothed, both states requiring a great deal of imaginative revision. Victor turned, startled. Oh, Lord Peter, I thought you'd gone. I rarely go until the fat lady sings, said Whimsy lightly. And I don't believe we've reached the aria. Victor gave a tight smile. Jenkins confessed. What more is there to sing about? That, said Whimsy, is precisely what interests me. He leaned against the stone rail. You see, my dear fellow, there is something about your part in this affair which feels curiously unfinished. You wrote to your aunt warning her of your suspicions, and yet you told no one else. Not the police, not the doctor, not even me, though we've had no shortage of opportunities. Victor shrugged, but the movement was brittle. It wasn't a certainty, just a fear. I didn't want to slander her without proof. Commendable. Whimsy's tone was neutral. And when she told you she'd heeded the warning, what then? You simply hoped for the best? Victor stared across the lawn. I suppose I thought it might frighten her into stopping. I didn't realize Jenkins— Ah, yes, Jenkins, interrupted Whimsy softly. Devoted, silent Jenkins, who just happened to find the letter, draw the appropriate inference, prepare the substance, and execute the act within a few short hours. Remarkable initiative for a man who claims he never finished school. Victor turned slowly. Are you saying— I'm saying, said Whimsy, that Jenkins may well have acted, but he was not alone in the orchestration. A silence stretched between them. Victor's eyes narrowed. Do you believe I had anything to do with it? Whimsy tilted his head. I believe, he said delicately, that you are a man who deals in words, not actions. But words, Mr. Larch, can be more deadly than deeds when correctly aimed. A note, a well-timed insinuation, a push here, a pull there, what is that if not murder in installments? Victor's face hardened. You said yourself, Jenkins confessed. And confessions, said Whimsy, are sometimes the final gift of the deceived. He believed he was acting alone. I do not think he was. Victor laughed then, a short, bitter sound. You've no proof? Not yet, said Whimsy cheerfully. But that is the inconvenience of crime, you see. One can never be quite certain that nothing has been left behind. A scrap of ash, a chemical stain, a missing page from a journal. Oh, incidentally, your uncle's journal was rather fastidiously kept. You wouldn't happen to know why the final 3 pages were torn out? No, I haven't been near his journal. I rather thought you hadn't. The edges were ripped hastily by someone without the librarian's finesse. Curious, really. One wonders what was written there. Victor was very still. Whimsy gave a small sigh. You see, Mr. Larch, there's one thing that doesn't sit well, the heater. It was not on a timer, as Jenkins claimed. Mrs. Thrale thought it was. But the switch was manual. It had to be turned on the night your uncle died. Victor's lips parted, but no sound emerged. And since Mrs. Thrale was reading upstairs, and Jenkins was preparing the study for the funeral guests, that leaves a narrow window, between 8 and past, say, when someone else must have done it. Victor took a half-step back. You can't prove that. Whimsy smiled. Not yet. But the housekeeper recalls seeing a light in the conservatory at 20 past 8. She assumed it was the cat. And it could have been, Victor said sharply, or a reflection. Indeed, it could have been. Except, Whimsy said, his voice now very soft, you signed the conservatory logbook that evening. What logbook? The one in the tool shed. The gardeners keep a record of maintenance entries. You borrowed secateurs, apparently. Left a note, pruning back vines, VL, dated and timed. Most obliging of you. Victor's face was white now. That's circumstantial. Whimsy nodded, almost delightfully so. But you see, the cyanide was fused with a bit of lamp oil, a method I understand, that requires access to the gardener's store and knowledge of combustion properties. I didn't kill him, Victor said suddenly. I didn't poison him. I only wanted her to stop. I thought if I pushed her far enough, she would leave him, or confront him. I didn't think Jenkins would— Ah, said Whimsy, so you admit you planted the suggestion, knowing it might be acted on. Victor's breath came fast now. It wasn't murder, it was theatre. I wrote the note, I left the heater on. I thought it would frighten him. A bluff, but I didn't know Jenkins had done anything. And when you realized he was dying, I panicked. I tore out the journal pages because he'd written something about Lydia. He blamed me for putting ideas in her head. I thought if they found those entries, they'd think I pushed her too. Whimsy was silent a moment. Then, with grave gentleness, he said, I dare say they would. And I dare say, in some moral sense, they might not be wrong. Victor turned away. Are you going to tell the police? Whimsy did not answer at once. He stood, watching the mist rise off the lawn, where the last of the frost was dissolving into dew. I shall tell them everything relevant, he said finally. What they choose to do with it, that is their burden. But conscience, Mr. Larch, that is yours. He turned and walked back toward the house, his coat flapping in the wind like the wings of an indignant academic owl, leaving Victor staring after him in the dissolving cold. Whimsy crossed the threshold of the hall with the calm of a man who had just plucked a trout from the stream by asking it nicely. He handed his coat to the housemaid, who took it with all the nervous reverence one might show a live grenade, and made his way back to the study. Inside, the air still bore a faint tang of scorched wool and the more permanent musk of leather-bound volumes and old cigar smoke. A quiet room now, stripped of its tyrant, yet echoing faintly with the tension that had long hung invisible from its corniced ceiling. He paused before the escritoire, where the journal had lain, now secured with the rest of the estate effects in preparation for probate. The torn pages troubled him, not just for what they concealed, but for what their very absence suggested. Victor's panic had driven him to tamper with a record that no one had as yet thought to read. Whimsy found it oddly hopeful in a perverse way. Guilt, to be useful, must have imagination. The truly soulless never bother to edit their own narratives. Footsteps in the hall broke the silence, a clipped rhythm, lighter than the housekeeper's tread, too decisive for a maid's. Mrs. Thrale entered with a composure that was almost theatrical, but carried off with that subtle confidence peculiar to women who have nothing left to lose and nothing more to hide. "My lord," she said coolly, "I heard Mr. Larch went out for air. Shall I have tea brought in?" Whimsy glanced up. If it's no imposition, I find the drama of death rather parching. She motioned to the footman, who disappeared with mechanical obedience, as if murder had not derailed the social mechanics of Gloucester Hall in the least. When the door shut again, she turned back to him. "So," she said, "you've spoken with Victor." Whimsy offered her a chair and perched himself by the fireplace, fingers laced. "I have, yes. I find him a most expressive young man, prone to metaphor and, if I may say, an alarming fondness for symbolically loaded gestures." "He wrote the note then?" she asked, not blinking. Whimsy smiled faintly. "He did," and turned on the heater. He meant it as a rehearsal. Jenkins, meanwhile, took it for opening night. Mrs. Thrale nodded slowly, as if that confirmed what she had long suspected. "So Victor is safe?" "Legally." Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "Possibly. Morally? Quite the opposite." She sat, hands resting neatly in her lap. "I didn't think it would go that far. I truly didn't. I never asked Jenkins to act. I only left the tea. I hoped it would make Richard suspicious, provoke a confrontation, even a confession." "A naive hope," Whimsy said gently. "You were trying to rouse a conscience that had atrophied decades ago." Mrs. Thrale looked away. "Yes, I suppose I was." The fire crackled. Tea arrived, too hot, slightly bitter, and they drank in companionable silence. Whimsy broke it at last, tapping a finger lightly against his cup. "There's one more question, if I may." "Always." "Why green?" Her eyes met his sharply, as if she had not expected the question, and then something in her expression relaxed, and she laughed, a short sound that was not without grace. "Ah, that blasted dress. It was not the color of mourning, nor of celebration, but it was deliberate." She smiled. "Richard always hated green. Said it made me look ghastly and pagan. He was forever telling me I had no sense of dignity in color. Said it reminded him of poison ivy." "How appropriate." "I wore it that morning," she continued, "because it was the first time I dressed without considering his opinion. I didn't know he would die that day, but I wanted to feel, I don't know, resistant, present, myself." Whimsy studied her a moment. "A small rebellion in silk." "Exactly." "And yet," he said quietly, "Victor saw it as a signal, a triumph." Her gaze flickered. "He would." He loves you in his way." She sighed. "He wants me to be someone worth loving. And you're not?" "I'm afraid I've become someone very practical instead." Whimsy gave her a look of faint approval. There are worse fates. The fire popped in the grate. A clock ticked, faint and insistent, somewhere beyond the door. Time resumed its march. "There's one last person I'd like to speak with," Whimsy said, rising. She tilted her head. "The vicar?" "No, the seamstress." Mrs. Thrale blinked. "Madame Letendre, but she only came on Tuesdays." "Precisely. And she was here the day before the death, was she not?" "I believe so. Why?" "She mentioned something to Bunter," said Whimsy, retrieving his coat with a murmured thanks. "About the master's weight. She thought he'd lost quite a bit. It occurred to me that might not be entirely irrelevant." Mrs. Thrale rose with him. "You think she noticed something?" "Madame Letendre notices everything," he said dryly. "But whether she understood it is another matter. I can have the car brought round." "No need. A little cold air may clarify my own understanding." He took his leave then, walking briskly down the gravel path and out onto the lane where the trees bowed under the pale weight of late winter. The village of Greatham was a short walk, its cottages clutching together like survivors of an old siege. Madame Letendre kept her shop behind a window crowded with bolts of wool and a headless dressmaker's dummy that looked faintly accusatory. She opened the door at his knock with a small squawk of surprise. "My lord," she said, smoothing her collar, "I was not expecting—" "Forgive the intrusion," Whimsy said, stepping lightly inside. "But I had a question regarding your visit to Gloucester Hall. You mentioned to my man Bunter that the late Mr. Thrale appeared thinner than usual." "Oui, yes," she said, folding her arms. "His waistcoat. Always I alter it. But this time it was looser, not natural. I thought perhaps it was the winter. One eats less, perhaps." "Perhaps," Whimsy said. "Did he mention feeling unwell?" "No. He only complained that the sleeves were too tight." "They were not. It was his shoulders, shrinking." "Did he drink tea while you worked?" "Always. Miss Felicia brought it." Whimsy's brows rose. "Felicia, the kitchen maid?" "Yes. She is young. She likes to listen to me talk. I do not mind." Whimsy leaned forward. "Do you recall how often she brought him tea in the last month?" Madame Letendre frowned. "Almost every day, I think. Around 4 o'clock." "Interesting. Thank you, madame." She blinked. "That's all?" "For now." He exited swiftly, his thoughts moving faster than his feet. Back at the hall he sought out Mrs. Thrale once more, who received him in the drawing-room with a question already in her eyes. "It wasn't the poison that killed him," he said softly. "Not entirely." Her brows drew together. "What do you mean?" "He had been consuming it in small doses. For weeks. Tea laced with just enough cyanide to weaken, to thin, to diminish, but not kill. Someone had been preparing him." Her hand flew to her mouth. "But Felicia—" "Likely did not know," said Whimsy. "But someone did. Someone who trained her to prepare it." Mrs. Thrale sank into her chair. "Oh, God!" Whimsy stood silent a moment, then said, "Jenkins acted as the executioner. Victor lit the fuse, but someone else laid the powder, grain by grain. If I'm not mistaken, we have yet another hand in this." Outside, the frost had returned. Inside, silence thickened like snowfall, ready to bury the final secret still hidden in the walls of Gloucester Hall. Whimsy slept lightly that night, if at all. The bed in the guest room was large and firm, draped in heavy wool blankets, and the faint scent of lavender sachets placed, he suspected, by Miss Candish's efficient hand. Yet sleep refused him, hovering at the edge of consciousness like a figure in the fog that never quite stepped forward. He lay awake with his hands folded behind his head, his thoughts pacing back through every room, every word, every omission. When morning crept in grey and reluctant through the curtains, he dressed without summoning Bunter and made his way quietly down to the morning room, where the household gathered for breakfast as though murder had been merely a passing draught from a badly sealed window. The atmosphere had thickened, of course, the silence more pronounced, the clinking of teaspoons against porcelain less assured. No one sat at the head of the table. The chair had not been removed, merely avoided. Victor was there, pale but composed, his eyes shadowed by the burden of almost having been a murderer, then nearly being mistaken for one. Miss Candish, too, cool as ever, her mouth a straight, precise line. Mrs. Thrale entered last, her hair swept back, her black cardigan giving her a kind of stark dignity. She caught Wimsey's glance and gave the smallest nod. After the meal, Wimsey returned to the study. The fire was already lit. Someone, he noted, had anticipated his arrival, and the room bore the melancholy warmth of a chamber long accustomed to weighty conversations. He stood before the cold grate where Richard Thrale had met his end and studied the narrow brass mesh that had warped in the heat, a fatal design flaw or a carefully chosen weapon. Bunter entered with a quiet footfall. "My lord, the inspector has arrived." Wimsey turned. "Ah, dear Inspector Hallard, let us show him our little theatre." The inspector, a tall, broad man with a face like a kindly bulldog, entered the study moments later, doffing his hat and accepting Wimsey's handshake with evident relief. "Glad you're still here, Lord Peter," he said. "I was half afraid I'd arrived to find you already back in London with a neat little telegram explaining the whole thing." Wimsey chuckled. "I do try to give local law enforcement the pleasure of participation." Hallard snorted, then glanced at the fireplace. "So it wasn't Jenkins?" "It was and it wasn't," Wimsey said, motioning him to a seat. "He lit the fire, yes. Believed he was assisting Victor in a symbolic act of protest, a rather idiotic bit of theatre involving a suicide note, if you please. But Victor never meant it to come to that. The real damage had been done long before that night." Hallard frowned. "By whom?" "Ah," said Wimsey, pouring 2 cups of coffee and handing one to the inspector. "Let me explain." He began to lay it out with the clarity of a man unburdening a complex clockwork piece he has finally understood. The gradual poisoning via adulterated tea, overseen unknowingly by a kitchen maid and orchestrated quietly by Miss Candish, whose motive was not revenge, precisely, but redress. A slow diminishment rather than a strike. Meanwhile, Victor's fury and despair had driven him to conceive a theatrical protest, one that Jenkins misread as a request for murder. But even these were symptoms, not cause. The true engine of the affair had been the quiet collusion of guilt, grief, and long-contained hate. Hallard listened, nodding, brow furrowing only when Wimsey described Miss Candish's role. "And you believe she knew about the cyanide?" he asked. "No," said Wimsey. "Not cyanide. The tea Miss Candish gave Felicia to use wasn't deadly. It was, I believe, a compound containing trace amounts of arsenic, easy enough to acquire in small medicinal quantities. It was meant to weaken him, not kill. A slow erasure, but it made him vulnerable. And when Jenkins lit the fire, he was too weak to escape," Hallard finished. He rubbed a hand over his jaw. "So we've got 3 suspects and no one we can clearly charge with murder." "Only one man wanted him dead, and that man is dead himself," Wimsey said. "The rest, well, their crimes are of a subtler kind." Hallard grunted. "It won't sit well with the magistrate." "It rarely does. Truth has never been an efficient servant of justice." A silence fell, companionable but heavy. Then the inspector stood and glanced around the room. "And what of the will?" he asked. "Any surprises?" Wimsey gave a tight smile. "As it happens, yes." He retrieved a sealed envelope from his coat pocket and handed it to Hallard. "I asked Miss Candish to produce a document she'd been keeping in the hall's lockbox. A new will, signed but not yet executed, dated a month before Thrale's death." Hallard's eyebrows rose. "And?" It disinherits Victor. The inspector blinked. But I thought, oh, he leaves the estate to Mrs. Thrale. Entirely. With a modest annuity for Miss Candish. Hallard swore under his breath. So Victor didn't even stand to gain? No, which makes his gesture all the more telling. He wasn't acting from greed, just rage. Pure, undiluted rage. The inspector folded the envelope into his coat. We'll need statements. You'll have them, Whimsy said, but I'd suggest you keep the emphasis on misadventure. That's as much clarity as the law's likely to handle in this case. Hallard grunted and left. Later that afternoon, Whimsy found himself in the garden, where Mrs. Thrale walked slowly beneath the skeletal archways of frost-covered hedges. She did not look up as he approached. I've often wondered, she said, what peace would feel like. I imagined it would be louder. Peace, said Whimsy, is often mistaken for numbness. The two tend to follow each other around. She gave a small, rueful smile. Will there be charges? Not against you, he said. Not against Victor or Miss Candish. Jenkins, perhaps, but I suspect the Crown won't pursue it. He's already paying his price. I suppose, she said, I'll have to decide what to do with the house. You'll inherit it? Yes, along with everything that's happened in it. He nodded. That's always the curse of inheritance. One receives both the land and the ghosts. They walked a little farther. The sun began to lower behind the distant trees, casting long blue shadows across the frost. Will you stay for dinner? She asked suddenly. No, said Whimsy gently. I think my part in this is done. The rest must be lived, not solved. She turned to him. Then thank you for giving the truth back to us, even if it hurts. Truth often does, he said, and touched his hat. He found Bunter already packing in the guest room, humming softly as he folded shirts into perfect thirds. Whimsy stood for a moment by the window, watching the grey light dim further across the lawn. Somewhere behind him, the house was beginning again, hesitant, cautious, but alive. A hall with no register, perhaps, but not, he thought, without memory. Shall we, Bunter? Yes, my lord. And they stepped out into the cold, where the car was waiting, its engine already warm, the road ahead blank but ready. But the road ahead did not remain blank for long. Though Whimsy had taken his leave with the dramatic finality of a Greek chorus receding behind the stage curtain, a question continued to pinch the hem of his intellect like a persistent child. Not a doubt, exactly. He had no reason to mistrust the deductions that had laid bare the crisscross of guilt in the Thrale household. But something small and unfinished, like a comma left dangling at the end of a well-turned sentence. He realized what it was while thumbing through his pocketbook in the railway carriage back to London. A scribbled note in his own hand. Curtains in study, drawn 9:30 p.m., not before. Jenkins' testimony uncertain. He stared at it for several seconds, the rhythm of the train lulling the surrounding air into a murmur, and then slowly lowered the notebook into his lap. Bunter, he said quietly. Yes, my lord. The man stirred from a reverie somewhere between nap and meditation. Do you recall what Jenkins said about lighting the fire the night Richard Thrale died? Bunter blinked. He said he lit it when Mr. Victor left the study, my lord. That was, I believe, shortly before 10. Indeed, and he said the curtains were already drawn. Yes, my lord. But Jenkins, for all his tremors and slack-jawed mannerisms, is a creature of habit. You remember what he told us in the scullery, that he draws the curtains promptly at 7 unless otherwise instructed. Just so. And yet he claimed the study curtains were already drawn when he entered that night at nearly 10. But Victor was there beforehand. Victor, who had no reason to close the curtains himself, particularly in a house that operated on ritual like clockwork. Bunter's brow furrowed. Someone else must have been in the study before Jenkins. Whimsy gave a short nod. And that someone had the presence of mind to draw the curtains. Why? To prevent someone from seeing in. or more precisely, said Whimsy, to prevent someone from seeing out. He rose suddenly, the carriage lurching gently beneath him, and fished in his coat for the folded plan of the house Miss Candish had provided during one of their initial interviews. There it was, the study's placement at the western end of the house, its windows looking out over the frost-bitten lawn and the crooked cedar tree Mrs. Thrale had remarked upon at breakfast. The study window, said Whimsy softly, half to himself, would have given a perfect view of the garden path. Bunter raised an eyebrow. Is it significant, my lord? I think it may be rather more than that. The rest of the journey passed in anticipatory silence. Once back in London, Whimsy made no immediate plans to return to Duke's Denver or to plunge into any other cases that required his attention. Instead, he spent a curious 48 hours in town, revisiting his notes, cross-checking statements, and making a discreet inquiry or two into a matter that would, to a less oblique mind, have seemed resolved. And on the third day, he returned to Wiltshire unannounced, much to the startled confusion of the housekeeper who admitted him with a flushed apology and sent a boy running to inform the household. He did not wait to be received in the drawing-room. Instead, he stepped briskly through the halls, returning to the study, now cleaned, aired, and robbed of its morbid atmosphere. He stood again before the fireplace and looked at the windows. In the pale morning light, the garden beyond was visible in perfect clarity, the cedar tree bending slightly in the breeze, the curve of the gravel path. One could see everything. He turned as a step sounded behind him. It was Miss Candish. Lord Peter, she said, her expression unreadable. You're back. Indeed. I forgot my sense of closure, and it's such a bother to travel without it. She did not smile. I came to ask a question, he said, moving to the sideboard and fingering a porcelain figurine that had not been there before. Something has been bothering me, Miss Candish. The fire, the poison, Victor's symbolic melodrama, all very dramatic. But you see, I keep wondering about the curtains. The curtains, she repeated cautiously. They were drawn, though they shouldn't have been. And that small detail tells me someone wanted to block the view. Wanted to be certain that the garden path could not be seen, which raises a delicate possibility. He turned slowly. That someone was outside the house that night. That someone left or arrived while Victor was in the study and Jenkins was dithering in the pantry. And that someone might have witnessed something or needed not to be seen. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. You see, he said, stepping closer, I believe you went out that night, Miss Candish. I believe you took a walk, though you told me otherwise. I believe you passed by the study window and saw someone inside. A confrontation, perhaps, or even the precise moment of Thrale's collapse. And I believe you returned to the house and said nothing, which leaves me wondering, why? She remained utterly still. Then, in a voice dry and quiet, she said, You're suggesting I stood outside and watched him die. I'm suggesting, he said, that you may have seen Victor with him, or Jenkins, or someone else entirely. Her eyes narrowed. What are you really asking? I'm asking, said Whimsy, whether Richard Thrale was alive when you saw him last. A long silence followed. Then she turned, crossed to the decanter, and poured herself a brandy with the neat efficiency of someone performing an office duty. When I passed by the study, she said, the curtains were open. I looked in, out of habit more than curiosity, and I saw him sitting there. Thrale, he was alone. I only glanced, long enough to see him slumped slightly as if asleep. I didn't think anything of it. And the curtains? I drew them myself when I came inside. It felt indecent somehow. To leave him sitting there like that in full view of the garden. I had no idea. She trailed off. Whimsy inclined his head. Thank you for your honesty. She gave him a long, unreadable look. And if I'd told you this before, I'd have believed you, he said, but perhaps not everyone would have. He moved to the window, adjusting the sash. "One more question, Miss Candish. You said nothing to anyone about this. Not even Mrs. Thrale?" "No? And yet the new will. How did you know where it was kept?" She didn't answer. "You see," said Whimsy softly, "that's the thread that's been bothering me. The will was not among Thrale's regular papers. It was hidden, locked away, and yet you produced it immediately upon request. Almost too readily." She set the glass down with a soft clink. "I knew he had changed it," she said. "He told me." "And you approved?" "No," she said. "I pitied him." "But you didn't tell Victor." "Would you have?" she asked, lifting her chin. "If the man you served was dying, and the son had no claim but blood, and the widow—" She stopped herself. "Ah," said Whimsy quietly. "And the widow?" She turned away. "I thought she deserved peace. That's all." He watched her for a moment longer, then stepped back from the window. "Very well," he said. "I think that concludes our little postscript." She did not reply, and he left her there, framed in the chill light like a still life, upright, solitary, and burdened with the silence of someone who had borne more than she dared reveal. Outside, Bunter waited by the car, polishing the headlamps with unnecessary care. "All settled, my lord?" "As settled as it ever shall be, Bunter," Whimsy replied, glancing once more at the house behind him, and this time he did not look back. The carriage rolled smoothly along the frost-hardened lanes, the countryside slipping past in a muted swirl of greys and browns, skeletal trees etched against a winter sky. Whimsy sat back, hands folded lightly in his lap, eyes tracing the faint patterns of cracking frost on the window pane. Bunter was quietly at his side, the ever-present figure of calm and discretion, polishing the silver tobacco box with a practiced hand. Despite the apparent resolution of the case at Duke's Denver, a restlessness clung to Whimsy like a second skin, an itch beneath his thoughts that refused to be scratched away by distance or certainty. The last conversation with Miss Candish had unsettled him in subtle ways, the evasions, the half-truths, the shadowed silences that hung heavier than any confession. There was something still concealed, a faint pulse behind the carefully closed doors of that household. He recalled the pattern of the night's events, each moment a fragment of a shattered mirror. The study curtains drawn too early, the unexpected presence of someone outside, the unspoken tensions threading through the rooms like a thin but taut wire. And now, Miss Candish's admission that she had seen Richard Thrale alive, slumped but breathing, only hours before his death. Yet her silence had been absolute until prompted, and even then she had guarded her words with the skill of a practiced sentinel. Whimsy broke the silence at last. "Bunter, you have been quietly cataloguing the household's movements since our return. Tell me, did anyone else have cause or opportunity to slip out unnoticed on the night in question?" Bunter considered a moment. "Only Miss Felicia, my lord. She was seen retiring early, but later Mrs. Thrale mentioned finding her missing from her room. It was thought she might have gone for a solitary walk in the grounds." Whimsy nodded slowly. "That would align with the possibility of someone else approaching or leaving the study window, concealed by the drawn curtains." "Indeed, my lord. But Miss Felicia is delicate, often unwell, and rarely ventures out alone at night. Sometimes the most fragile are driven by the fiercest urgencies." The carriage drew into a small weathered inn at the village outskirts, the horses' hooves crunching against frozen gravel. Whimsy and Bunter alighted, and after a brief conversation with the landlord, they found themselves in the snug, dimly lit back parlor where Felicia Thrale sat wrapped in a woolen shawl, her pale face framed by loose curls, eyes large with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Miss Thrale," Whimsy began gently, "I trust you will forgive my intrusion. We have questions, as you can imagine." Felicia looked up, a flicker of stubborn pride crossing her features. "I have nothing to hide, Lord Peter." I believe that, but sometimes the truth is like a labyrinth, and even the clearest eyes can miss a turn or two. She swallowed hard. What do you want to know? Whimsy took a slow breath. I need to understand your movements on the night your father died. You left your room after 7, is that correct? Yes. I couldn't sleep. And you wandered the grounds. Felicia's eyes darted to the window as if it might answer for her. I suppose you could call it wandering. I was upset. Frightened, really. Father and Victor arguing again, loud enough to wake the whole house. I needed air. Did you pass by the study? Yes. And did you see anyone there? She hesitated, voice dropping to a whisper. I thought I saw someone. Someone standing by the window inside. But it was dark and I was far enough away that it could have been a shadow. I was too afraid to stop. Whimsy's eyes narrowed slightly. Was it your father? No, she said quickly. I don't think so. The figure was tall and still. I thought it was Victor. But Victor was out on the terrace a few minutes later when Jenkins found him, Bunter added softly. Felicia's hands clenched in her lap. I don't know what I saw. It was all a blur. Whimsy exchanged a glance with Bunter. The puzzle was deepening. The presence at the study window was not Thrale, nor clearly Victor, a third party, unseen before. Thank you, Miss Thrale. You have been most helpful. Later, as they returned to the car, Whimsy's mind worked swiftly. If Felicia had seen a tall figure at the study window, one who was neither her father nor Victor, who else in the house could it have been? The servants were accounted for, their movements rigidly tracked. The only possibility was a guest, but no other visitors had been registered. Or perhaps someone had slipped in from outside. The thought brought him back to the garden, to the twisted cedar tree silhouetted against the night. He recalled the faint imprint of footprints in the frost, noticed in passing by Jenkins, who had fumbled with their explanation. Bunter, he said quietly, return with me to Duke's Denver. We have one more shadow to illuminate. The air was sharper as they approached the house once more, the windows darkened against the encroaching dusk. Inside, Miss Candish greeted them with measured surprise, but no alarm. I'm afraid you are not expected, she said with thin civility. I find that in matters of truth, expectations are frequently misplaced, Whimsy replied smoothly. He asked to see the study once again, and studied the window closely by the light of a lantern. There, just beneath the sill, was the faintest indentation in the soil, a shallow depression in the frost, no larger than a boot print. Jenkins missed this, Whimsy murmured. Footprints, said Bunter. And the way is clear, Whimsy said, voice low. Someone came and went through this window. He turned to Miss Candish. You must know more than you have said. You were the only one with free movement in this house, the only one who could have opened a window unnoticed. Her eyes flashed suddenly, and a flicker of something, defiance or despair, crossed her features. You are very clever, Lord Peter, but cleverness will not always bring comfort. I do not seek comfort, Whimsy said, only truth. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Very well. There is something I have withheld. Something I did to protect a secret I thought dead. Whimsy leaned forward, his attention sharpening. The air between them thickened. Tell me everything, he said quietly. She began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper, weaving the final threads that would bind this tangled tale into a coherent whole. Threads of loyalty, fear, and a desperate attempt to shield the living from the dead's long shadow. As she spoke, the fog of mystery lifted, revealing the hidden hands that had steered the fatal night. By the time she finished, the room was heavy with the weight of confession and the sudden, sharp clarity of resolution. Whimsy nodded slowly. Now the story is complete. The shadows can finally retreat. Outside, the wind moaned through the cedars, but inside, the long night was ending. The drawing room at Duke's Denver was oppressively still, as though the walls themselves held their breath. The fire had been lit, though it was a mild spring evening, and cast a flickering orange light on the polished surfaces and severe portraits that lined the panelling. Lord Peter Wimsey stood at the hearth, apparently studying the flame with far greater interest than his assembled audience deserved. Mrs. Thrale sat rigidly upright, dressed, as always, in tasteful but uncompromising black. Victor Thrale hovered near the drinks tray, pretending to fumble with a decanter. Miss Candish, pale but composed, perched on the edge of a brocade armchair, her hands tightly clasped. Inspector Hallard, summoned by a telegram and wearing the weary look of a man who suspected he was about to be rendered superfluous, leaned against the door frame. Bunter, silent and exact, stood discreetly behind Wimsey. Wimsey stirred at last. "Dear me," he said airily, "it's a positively Miltonic tableau, isn't it? One half expects Satan to leap from the fire with a legal document in hand. But no matter, we are come to the end of our little masquerade, and as always, the final unmasking is the most delicate business." Victor set down the decanter with an audible clink. "I don't see why we're all here, Lord Peter. You've been poking about in ledgers and diaries, questioning servants, dragging us to London and back. If you've found something, say it." "Oh, I shall, my dear Victor. But the telling must follow the music, and we're only just reaching the final movement." He turned then, abruptly businesslike. "To begin, Richard Thrale was indeed poisoned. That much was made deliberately plain by the perpetrator, not through clumsiness, but as a sleight of hand. The murder had to look like a desperate act, perhaps by someone overwrought. Miss Candish, for instance, a faithful companion, misused, discarded from the will." He turned to the girl, who blanched but said nothing. Except she didn't do it. She did, however, tamper with the teacup after the fact, not to harm, but to protect. She believed wrongly that Victor had committed the crime in some moment of filial rage. Admirable loyalty, if misguided. And the beauty of it was that everyone saw what they expected to see. A bitter woman, a resentful heir. No need to look further. Hallard cleared his throat. "So who did poison him, then?" Wimsey's smile was thin. "I told you before, Inspector, that this was not simply a crime of passion. It was a crime of arithmetic." He crossed to the sideboard and retrieved a slim ledger, now worn at the spine. Mr. Thrale, it seems, had been shifting his money abroad for some time, under a pseudonym through a man named Langley, whom we now know to be an alias for an accountant previously struck off for embezzlement. The goal: to leave his family with nothing, not a farthing. The new will, naming only Mrs. Thrale, was a hollow gesture. She'd have found the accounts empty once probate cleared. He looked directly at her. "And you knew it, didn't you?" Her hands twitched, just slightly, but her voice was composed. "He told me he was revising the trust, that it would take time." "Quite. But you, unlike Victor or Miss Candish, had full access to his correspondence. You saw the names, the transfers. You found the real Langley, didn't you? Or rather, you found him missing, silenced, paid off, perhaps dead. And you realized, once your husband was gone, everything would disappear offshore. You would be left destitute after years of tolerating his tyranny." She stood then, stiffly. "You think I murdered him for money?" "I think you murdered him for dignity, for retribution, for the final word in a marriage that had become a prison. The poison wasn't in the tea. It was already in his stomach, slipped into the decanter the night before when you took him his usual glass." Her lips parted. Once, twice, but no sound came. "You even drew the curtains yourself?" "Unusual, that. The servants always did it. But not that night, because you wanted to control the scene, to misdirect suspicion, to frame Miss Candish if needed, or Victor. Anyone but yourself." Victor stared. "But why the fire? Why burn the study?" Wimsey nodded toward the hearth. because the documents were damning, not just financial, personal. Richard kept everything, letters, threats. You burned them because you knew I'd find them, and because the symbolism of fire suits the operatic temperament, doesn't it? She sank slowly into her chair. Her voice, when it came, was low. I only meant to frighten him at first, but he laughed at me, said I would die penniless, that I was a bauble to be discarded. Whimsy inclined his head. And so you discarded him first. Hallard moved forward. Mrs. Thrale, I must ask you. She lifted a hand. No need, Inspector. I'll come quietly. As Hallard escorted her from the room, Miss Candish rose. I never imagined, she began, but Whimsy silenced her gently. None of us ever does. We all wear veils of civility, Miss Candish, until something tears them away. Victor, dazed, asked, What happens now? Whimsy looked at him with a curious softness. You rebuild, Mr. Thrale, as best you can. The estate is still yours, if somewhat leaner than you expected, and you might consider being kinder to those still in your life. Miss Candish, for instance. Victor flushed, and Miss Candish, surprised, lowered her eyes. Later, as the sun set in long golden fingers across the lawns, Whimsy and Bunter prepared to depart. The car stood ready, its engine humming with restrained impatience. Whimsy paused on the doorstep, gazing up at the ivy-wrapped facade. Curious thing, Bunter. We search for truth in parlors and ledgers and often forget the quiet motives, the buried grievances. But they never quite go away, do they? No, my lord. And yet, Whimsy said, stepping into the car, we do what we can to unearth them, tidy them up, and put them back in order, like good little butlers of justice. The engine roared softly to life. As they drove away, Duke's Denver receded into the dusk, a house of secrets now spent, its widow unmasked, its ghosts, for the moment, laid to rest.